So I got another entry into the anti-despair reading list. This one is Rutger Bregman's Humankind, A Hopeful History. This is a great book. Bregman basically goes through a bunch of different misconceptions that we have about human nature and kind of breaks down why they're actually wrong. Some of the things he debunks include the Stanford prison experiment, Stanley Milgram and kind of the shock experiment, if you've ever heard of that, and also the murder of Kitty Genovese, which are all used as instances as to like why humans don't care about each other. But the one that I think is probably the most interesting, and the one that I'll talk about here, is his really fighting against the message that we got in the book The Lord of the Flies. If you haven't read Lord of the Flies, then, spoiler alert, but it's about a bunch of British school kids who get stranded on a deserted island, and without the guiding hand of authority and order, they slowly start to turn into like absolutely savage animals and resorting to some pretty horrific violence. It's used as kind of a metaphor a lot of the time for what humanity would look like without the civilizing effect of authority and the state. The problem is that Lord of the Flies is complete and utter bullshit. Golding based it off of his war experiences, and he also based it off of the fact that he was a school teacher, and he tried to test it out with his school kids. But as it turns out, the reason the kids behaved terribly is because he encouraged them to. The authority was the one that got them to do the horrible shit. Bregman brings up an actual real-life example where a bunch of school kids got stranded on an island, and the results were incredibly different. The premise of what really happened couldn't have been much more similar. These kids basically stole someone's boat because they wanted a life of adventure and they wanted to sail off to someplace. But what ended up happening is they got caught in a storm, and their boat got blown to a deserted island where they had to spend like 18 months. While they were there, rather than falling to pieces, they formed a tiny little society where they did amazing things. When they were finally rescued, they found that they had built chicken coops. One of the kids had fallen off of a cliff and broken his leg, and rather than just letting him die, the other kids put it in a splint and basically took turns taking care of him. They had a fire which they never let go out, and they basically worked in shifts to make sure this fire stayed up. Every single kid that was involved in this wreck ended up surviving and actually kind of thriving on this deserted island, to the point where they remained friends for the rest of their lives. It's worth noting that this book is basically Bregman making a bunch of anarchist arguments about human nature. He even cites a bunch of anarchist texts in the notes, but he never mentions anarchy in any way except kind of like a negative way, I think like once in the book. So that's a little bit funny because he's basically making anarchist arguments. But it is definitely worth reading because it is absolutely true. There are a lot of ways in which we assume that human beings are terrible, but what's really terrible is the way that our authority kind of pushes us into doing awful things.